family name can survive for 500 years and still tell you almost nothing about the bloodline you think it represents. This is not really a story about surnames. It is a story about how names preserve history, while DNA can expose the people and migrations that history left out. For much of American history, a surname has looked like a fixed point on the map of identity. A name such as Johnson, Williams, Brown, Smith, Jackson, or Washington can appear in records stretching back generations. The name may sit beside a date in a church register, a census entry, a military document, a land deed, or a grave marker. It feels permanent, but permanent is not the same as ancient. In Europe, hereditary surnames developed at different times and for different reasons. Some came from occupations. Smith, for example, developed from the occupation of a blacksmith. Others came from places, physical descriptions, relationships, or given names. Johnson developed as a patronymic, meaning son of John. Williams similarly developed from William. Brown could describe a person's appearance. These names were not necessarily created by one single family. They could develop independently in different communities. And when these naming systems crossed the Atlantic, they did not arrive in an empty landscape. European colonists carried their surnames into North America. Enslaved Africans were frequently denied control over their names and identities. Indigenous people encountered governments, churches, schools, and legal systems that often imposed or recorded names in unfamiliar ways. Immigrants later adapted, translated, shortened, or replaced names as they entered American society. So the surname appearing in a document is not necessarily the surname that existed 5 generations earlier. And that matters, because the American family tree is not a single line. It is a collision of migrations, forced migrations, marriages, adoptions, name changes, disappearances, and reinventions. The old name can survive even when the old bloodline does not. The first federal census, taken in 1790, is a perfect reminder of why names in American records must be read carefully. It was designed as a population count, not as a modern genealogy database. In that first census, the federal government generally recorded the name of the head of the household, while other household members were represented through age and sex categories. Later censuses became much more detailed. The 1850 census was the first federal census to name every individual in the household. And even the 1790 records contain major gaps. Schedules for several states were lost. That means the earliest surviving record of a surname is not necessarily the beginning of the family. It is simply the earliest surviving record we have found, and the names themselves can be deceptive. The United States Census Bureau has shown that Smith, Johnson, Williams, Brown, and Jones were among the country's most common surnames in its 2010 surname data. That widespread presence is important because a common surname may have developed independently in many different places. A name can therefore be historically old without representing one single biological family. The surname may be old, the bloodline may be another story. The first explanation is the cautious one. Your surname may actually preserve a genuine paternal lineage. In societies where surnames and family names were passed from father to son, the Y chromosome traveled through the same basic biological route. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son, and that means men carrying the same relatively uncommon surname can sometimes have Y chromosome signatures that point toward a shared male ancestor. One of the clearest demonstrations came from a 2006 study of Irish surnames. Researchers tested 1,125 men carrying 43 different surnames. They compared the surnames with 17 Y chromosome short tandem repeat markers, and they found something remarkable. There were significant genetic differences between many surname groups. For some names, the evidence suggested a major founding paternal lineage, but there was an important limitation. No surname examined in that study had more than about half of its current bearers descended from one original founder. That is the first warning. A surname can preserve a real genetic signal without being a perfect genetic fingerprint. The second explanation is more complicated. A surname can have multiple founders. Imagine a village where several unrelated men are all called John. Their sons become John's sons. Eventually, several unrelated families inherit versions of the same surname. Centuries later, their descendants may share a name while carrying very different Y chromosomes. This is not a fringe possibility. Research on surnames in Europe has repeatedly found that common names can have multiple independent origins. The 2006 Irish study provides a striking example. Researchers found that some surnames, including O'Sullivan and Ryan, showed evidence consistent with major ancestral lines. Other common names, including Murphy and Kelly, showed evidence of numerous founders. The difference helps explain why some surnames behave almost like genetic clans, while others do not. A relatively uncommon surname may have a stronger connection to one paternal lineage. A very common surname may represent many unrelated families that happen to acquire the same name. So if your last name is common, its age alone tells you very little. Then comes the third explanation. The surname itself may have survived through social history while the biological ancestry underneath it changed. That can happen through adoption, marriage, name changes, migration, non-paternity, forced renaming, or simply because a man can inherit a surname without inheriting exactly the same ancestry associated with its earliest bearers. Modern genetic genealogy has shown just how powerful this disconnect can be. In 2013, researchers published a study in the journal Science called Identifying Personal Genomes by Surname Inference. They demonstrated that surnames could sometimes be recovered from Y chromosome genetic information by combining YSTR profiles with publicly accessible genetic genealogy databases. The researchers showed that genetic information that appeared anonymous could sometimes be connected to a surname. And when additional information such as age and location was added, the identity of an individual could potentially be narrowed down even further. Think about what that means. The surname can sometimes point toward the Y chromosome, but the Y chromosome can also point back toward the surname. The name and the chromosome can travel together, but they do not always travel together. A 2009 study examining British and Irish surname patterns also showed why this relationship is complicated. Researchers found that surnames can contain recognizable Y chromosome clusters, but that those clusters can reflect multiple founders, demographic expansion, and changes within male lineages over time. So the surname is not a genetic barcode. It is more like a historical signal, and signals can be strong. They can be weak, they can overlap, and sometimes they can point in completely different directions. There is another biological limitation that is easy to miss. A surname is normally inherited through a social system. DNA is inherited through biological reproduction. Those two systems overlap, but they are not the same system. The Y chromosome follows one narrow paternal path. If you are a man, your Y chromosome comes through your father's 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 line. That makes Y DNA unusually useful for researching surname history. But it also creates a major limitation. Your Y chromosome represents only one branch of your entire ancestry. One branch. Your family tree contains hundreds and eventually thousands of ancestors. Your Y chromosome represents just one narrow paternal thread running through that enormous network. Mitochondrial DNA gives us another narrow line. It follows the maternal line from mother to child. Again, it represents only one branch of the larger story. Autosomal DNA is different. It samples ancestry across many branches of the family tree. But the further back in time you go, the harder it becomes to connect every genetic segment to a specific ancestor. So when someone says, "My DNA says I am this, but my surname says I am that," the contradiction may actually be artificial. They may simply be comparing different pieces of the family tree. And this is where the American story becomes especially complicated. The United States was built through repeated population movement. People arrived under radically different circumstances. Some came voluntarily, some came through forced migration, some were displaced, some were adopted into new communities. Some changed their names, some had their names changed for them, and the records created about these people were not equally detailed. They were not equally preserved, and they were certainly not equally fair. A major 2014 genetic study examining more than 160,000 people in the United States found extensive genetic mixture among African Americans, Latinos, and European Americans. The researchers found evidence of African, European, and Native American ancestry appearing in different proportions across populations and regions. For African Americans in that particular dataset, the researchers estimated average ancestry at roughly 73% African, 24% European, and less than 1% Native American. But those numbers were averages from that study's participants. They were not a universal genetic formula for every African American. And that distinction matters, because DNA can reveal ancestry that a surname never recorded. Sometimes the silence is the evidence. Imagine standing in an American cemetery where the stones stretch back generations. You see the same surname repeated across weathered markers: father, son, grandson. The names appear to form a straight line through time. Now imagine the DNA beneath those names as a second record. Some lines stay together, others branch away. A maternal lineage can carry a completely different geographic history from the surname. A Y chromosome can point toward one paternal origin, while the rest of the genome reflects generations of mixture. Somewhere in that cemetery, a name that looks European may sit on a genome carrying African ancestry. Somewhere else, a familiar American surname may belong to descendants whose ancestors entered the family through adoption, marriage, migration, or a name change. The stones look simple, the people were not. Here's the twist that changes how you have to read the entire story. DNA does not prove that a surname is false. It reveals that a surname was never the whole family tree. That distinction is enormous. Consider the history of African Americans in the United States. Many descendants of enslaved people encounter a genealogical wall before the Civil War. The problem is not that their ancestors had no history. The problem is that the records often did not preserve that history in the way modern genealogists would want. Enslaved people were frequently documented through systems that prioritized owners and property rather than individual family histories. Names could change, families could be separated, records could disappear, and entire generations can become difficult to trace through conventional genealogy. Yet genetics can sometimes reconnect pieces that paper records lost. In 2023, researchers published a community-engaged ancient DNA study involving 18th century African-descended individuals associated with Charleston, South Carolina. The researchers generated genomic data from 18 individuals and examined their uniparental genetic markers. The results revealed diverse ancestral connections to populations in Western Africa. One individual showed genomic affiliation with Fulani populations of West Africa. The study demonstrated something important. Ancient DNA can recover information about people whose identities and origins were poorly preserved in surviving historical records. And another project takes that idea even further. At the Catoctin Furnace African American Cemetery in Maryland, researchers analyzed DNA from 27 historical individuals, dating from approximately 1774 to 1850. They compared those genetic profiles with a large modern genetic database. The researchers identified tens of thousands of genetic relatives among consenting participants. They were able to connect historical individuals with living descendants, and the results showed African ancestry connected to populations including Wolof and Congo, alongside European ancestry associated with Great Britain and Ireland. Think about what happened there. The paper trail had gaps. The genetic trail provided another route through the past. But we have to be careful. DNA can reveal ancestry without giving us a complete name, culture, identity, or biography. A genetic match can suggest that two people share ancestors. It cannot automatically tell us what those ancestors called themselves. It cannot automatically tell us what language they spoke. And it cannot automatically tell us how they understood their own identity. That is why the strongest explanation is not that DNA has replaced history. It is that DNA and history can expose each other's blind spots. A surname may tell you what a family was called at a particular point in time. Y-DNA can tell you about one narrow paternal line. Mitochondrial DNA can follow one narrow maternal line. Autosomal DNA can capture pieces of ancestry across many branches, and historical documents can tell you where people lived, who they married, what work they performed, what institutions controlled their lives, what names they were recorded under, and sometimes what happened to them. None of these records is the entire story. Together, they become something much closer to one. This is why the phrase oldest family name can be misleading. A surname can be ancient as a word and recent as a family line. It can be old in Europe and new in America. It can be shared by unrelated families. It can disappear from one branch and survive in another. It can be imposed on people who did not choose it. It can be changed by immigration, marriage, adoption, or personal choice. And it can remain written on a grave long after the ancestry behind the name has become a complicated mixture of places and peoples. That complexity is not evidence that the family was broken. It may be evidence that the family survived. The American family tree is filled with people who crossed oceans, people who survived forced migration, people who entered new communities, people who married across boundaries, people who changed names, people who lost names, people who reclaimed names, and people who carried fragments of older worlds into new ones. DNA does not make those stories less American. It makes the American story harder to reduce to a single origin. And perhaps that is what the oldest names are really preserving. Not purity, not a perfectly unbroken bloodline. Memory. A name can survive because someone kept using it. A genetic lineage can survive because someone survived long enough to pass it on. A family can survive even when the documents disappear. So when you look at your surname, the most interesting question may not be, where did this name come from? It may be, who carried this name when its story changed? Because the name on the page is only one witness. The DNA is another. The archives are another. And somewhere between them is a family history that may be far older, stranger, and more resilient than the surname alone ever suggested. Your surname was never simply what you thought it was. And if DNA could expose one hidden branch of your family tree, what else might still be waiting inside the names we have carried for generations?